Nobody expected that the law enforcement in this country would have such a disgusting disregard for Canadian citizens. Just brutal beatings of Canadian citizens. This is Justin Trudeau's Tiananmen Square moment, as far as I'm concerned.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Freedom Feature, and I'm your host, Barry Bussey. With me today, I have Tom Marazzo, who has become quite a famous name in recent months in Canada as a result of the Trucker Convoy, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You know, Tom, I tell you, this has been quite a year. First of all, let's know a little bit about Tom. Who are you? Where are you from? And what's been your experience?
Oh, wow. I feel like I've been all over the place. The last 6 months have been absolutely insane. I'm actually born and raised in Niagara Falls, and I spent a fair amount of time in St. Catharines as well. I came from the military. I joined the reserves when I was very early. I was 16 years old. I was in my 17th year, so I was allowed to join after January. And then I graduated Niagara College. I joined the regular force in 1998 as a combat engineer officer. I lived all over. You know, I've lived in Quebec. I've lived in New Brunswick. I've lived in a bunch of different postings all across Ontario. Mm-hmm. And I retired in 2015 medically from the military. And I went back to school. I did a software degree. And then as soon as I finished the software degree, I was teaching at Georgian College in Barrie. You know, the mandates came out. And I pushed back really hard, and I sent an email to the president of the college and as many faculty and deans as I could find, and basically stating my very clear objection to mandating that I undergo a medical procedure of any kind as a condition of employment. And within a few days, I was fired with cause. Things started to change really quickly. Sold the house, moved. Next thing you know, I'm in Ottawa with a bunch of truckers. Like really, yeah.
So Tom, I just want to open up just a wee little bit about your stand with respect to the vaccine mandate. What was it? Just the idea of being coerced into having to take the vaccine? Was that your objection? What was your
many objections? To be honest, I could take the angle of just the medical aspect of this. Because there's no completed clinical trials. Like, this is done under something called an interim order. And the Americans call it an emergency use authorization.
Right.
This is the challenge with this, is that you cannot, in either Canada or the United States, you cannot issue an emergency use authorization or an interim order if there is no alternative viable treatment to the illness that you're trying to stop or prevent. But we've always known that we've had very good, solid, viable treatments to COVID-19. So it made the vaccine really null and void in terms of the issuance of an interim order. There's no justifiable reason for only viewing this vaccine as the only option. Now, why do you issue an interim order? And that is so that you can get around clinical trials, so that you don't have to have clinical trials. Now, let's go over to the legal aspect of this. And I'm not a lawyer, but man, I've got a crash course in the law over the last 2.5 years. Like, it's insane. But here's the thing about informed consent. There are laws around informed consent. They are very clearly spelled out laws. And if a doctor violates informed consent, that's considered under the Criminal Code of Canada, criminal assault. So you cannot use coercion to force a patient to undergo a medical experiment, nor can you use, under the Privacy Act, privacy laws in this country, you cannot be forced to disclose your private medical information to anybody except you and your doctor can't even force you. So there are just far too many laws in this country that are meant to protect us, the public, from government overreach.
And we also have the human rights legislation.
Yes.
That also protects us.
Yes. And so we're protected by these multiple layers of laws in this country. And what we had seen is that Now, you've got a waiter or a waitress who is now walking around with impunity, violating the Privacy Act and asking you for your confidential medical information.
Mm.
You've got employers that are now in charge of your body as a condition of employment. When I was fired, I was denied unemployment insurance. But
Mhm.
it's strange because for the 35 years I paid into it, it was never a condition of paying into EI that I go and get a medical procedure that I didn't want. We've thrown out every law, every common sense aspect of what it means to be a free and democratic society. I just vehemently rejected the idea that an employer felt they had a legitimate right to use coercion to force me to take a medical injection or a medical procedure that I did not want, because there are viable treatments to it. It is not life-threatening, and we've known that it wasn't life-threatening. I mean, we're looking at a fatality rate of 0.003%. It's actually, influenza is more deadly than COVID has been.
Mm.
So when you look at this and you put it all together, it's like you don't have the right to tell me what I can and cannot put in my body, or should not put into my body as a condition of employment. What blows my mind is the number of academics at the college that I belong to that actually came out very aggressively against me. And it just goes to show you the lack of critical thinking as on, supposed educators that pride themselves on critical thinking or teaching it, but they can't exercise it.
Were there no allies in your cause there at the college?
There was about 25 that finally came forward. We're in a Telegram group, but they aren't unknown to the college. I was the one who stuck my neck out because I felt that I have my Army pension at the time, so I was less vulnerable than the other members of the group that I was in. And at the time I sent the original letter, there was only 5 of us. But after I sent out the letter, we grew to a total of 25.
And how large is that faculty? Sorry.
It's not the biggest college. It's not the smallest college, but even in my original email I sent out, I think the faculty is somewhere around 600. And I was only able to reach 250 people on my original email. Of that 250, within, I think, an hour, the college had pulled my email down from the server. So I didn't reach that many. Many people were denied all of their exemptions. One case, one of the exemptions were for religious exemptions, and the VP of HR actually quoted the Pope himself as a reason to deny this person's religious exemption.
Which totally goes against established law in this country. I mean,
Yes.
It's always been the freedom of the individual, not the church or the religious community they belong to.
Yes. I look at collectively across every institution that tried to implement these mandates. Now, what's really interesting too is you've seen what the government of Ontario and the chief medical officer a few months ago was basically passing the buck. It's a hot potato, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Doug Ford says, well, it wasn't me, it was my chief medical officer. My chief medical officer, I couldn't dare go against him. It was political suicide to go against my chief medical officer. Then the chief medical officer came out and said, well, we never actually created legislation to force you to do it. It was the employers that did it, right? It's like, all right, who's in charge around here? Who got elected to make these decisions? It's just complete abdication of responsibility. And it's disgusting. And in Ontario, unfortunately, Ontarians had the lowest voter turnout in Ontario history, and they re-elected Doug Ford with an overwhelming majority. He actually earned, I think, 20 additional seats than he had previous to the election. People in Ontario were absolutely, entirely too lazy to take any actual steps to maybe put an end to this guy.
I wonder if it's also a situation, because we had such a low turnout, people are losing trust in the institution. And that to me is a very worrying sign.
I think that we've lost trust in every single institution within our society. Education, as far as I'm concerned, even listen to a guy like Jordan Peterson talk about the education system in this country. And of course, he was a U of T professor. Police, look at the courts, look at medicine. Even religious institutions have completely abandoned their followers, right?
Mhm.
And this is all based on fear. And you'll never convince me that the mainstream media or the liberal funded media was ever to be trusted.
Yeah.
And I just recorded on my YouTube channel a video about mainstream media and how I feel about them and what they've done. I think one of the worst institutions that we have in this country, the very megaphone that Justin Trudeau has used to rip this country apart, has always been liberal funded media. Maybe it's not fair to say liberal funded media. Let's just say government funded media, because the CBC is one of the worst. They're funded by taxpayers. They have been funded by taxpayers since their inception. We've got a very terrible relationship with the legacy media in this country.
They were known as what we call the fourth branch, or at least they called themselves the fourth branch, right? Because
Yes.
for our viewers out there, we often think about government as being three branches: the judiciary, the executive, meaning the prime minister and the prime minister's office, and the legislature. And then the media would claim, well, we're the fourth branch because we keep everyone accountable.
Yes.
And the reality is, what we've seen over the last couple of years is no one's held accountable. It's incredible how the media has just totally taken up the government narrative and ran with it.
Yeah, and there's this perverse relationship between the executive branch right now and the media, in terms of, like, I don't view the legacy media as journalism. I view it solely as propaganda. There's a message out there that the government of Canada wants to push forward. And since they control the budget, or the subsidization of a lot of the government funded media, they're going to get in line. And if they know what's good for them, they're going to keep pushing this narrative, this story, and they are going to do their very best to steamroll anybody who has any opposition or even calls out the media for being liars. And over and over and over again, you're seeing these stories in the mainstream media, even about the convoy, that have all been proven to be false. What's interesting to me is that it is alternative media that is exposing the mainstream media for being the liars that they are.
How did you get to be involved with the convoy yourself?
I had moved. The mother of my daughter, she answered a Facebook post to do a play date between two kids. And so we went to this play date. We met the parents of the other child. We hit it off really, really well. Very like-minded. The husband introduced me to another person. This other person, and I didn't know, this other person was actually connected to a group called Canada Unity. When the convoy rolled through, I got a call from this new friend who was connected to Canada Unity and said, hey, could you take a call with a guy named James Botter and his wife, Sandy? So I said, yeah, sure. I thought that the expectation of that meeting was just to sort of advise them on sort of the way forward now that they were in Ottawa. They'd been there for 2 days. This is Sunday that I was speaking to them. At the end of the conversation, they said, look, would you be just willing to come here to Ottawa and give us a hand for a couple days? And I said, yeah, sure, why not? And so, packed a bag. Next thing you know, 3 hours later, I was sitting in Ottawa. It was that simple. And I ended up staying for 22 days.
So what was your role? What was your role to help out here?
Well, initially, it was really to come up with a really solid sustainment plan, just to get them so that they could live there in their trucks on the street for as long as it took to end the mandates. That was sort of my initial thing, to make sure that was really well organized and running smoothly, so that really they could just sustain themselves for the duration. But then, as time sort of rolled on, I started to bring in a couple of friends who were also former military, and I passed on sort of that day-to-day logistics piece to them. And then my role started to transition, where I was working with the lawyers from the JCCF more regularly. And then we started to really work with the leaders of the convoy. We started to work with the city, started to look big picture. If I was looking day to day in the military, we'd say, I was looking down and in. But as time went on and other people took over that day-to-day role, it was easier for me to look up and out, because we knew at some point something had to change. We were all trying to put together, myself, the lawyers, members of the board. It wasn't just me. There was a lot of us trying to come up with a framework or some sort of a strategy to get the ball moving or progressing down the field. So that we could all go home, but go home with removing these mandates and on a path to getting this country back to normal. Over time, my role just kind of evolved towards more of a strategic picture.
And so were you involved then in negotiations with the city and that kind of thing, and just trying
Yeah,
to...
I was in those meetings. I was in a meeting with the city manager, a one-on-one I had with him, and then with the mayor. But with the lawyers joined in subsequently after the meeting with the city manager. My sense was, there was a lot of appetite with the city manager, probably some of the other leadership within the city, with some of the police, not all, to work together to get this done. But I have to say my greatest disappointment to those efforts was always with the mayor of Ottawa. Far too often, this man, he acts in bad faith. I would certainly never trust him if I ever had to work opposed to him again. Members of the police completely acted in bad faith. That was really frustrating, especially for the police liaison team that I routinely dealt with. I really felt bad for them oftentimes because I knew that they were working to try to resolve issues, but they had to go back to their leadership and I think get kind of blindsided by their own leadership at times. We worked hard to make things happen that were definitely responsible all the time and safe. And they knew that. The police knew that we were trying to be safe and responsible. And I think they try to convey that message upwards to their chain of command. But, the mayor of Ottawa has federal political aspirations and ambitions. And I think he was more interested in pleasing Justin Trudeau than he was working with the truckers to resolve any of these issues in a responsible manner.
There's several things that come out here. One is the convoy has been cleared by the press saying that it was violent, it was, or at least intimidating. People going along the streets were felt they were harassed, because if they wore a mask and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I can tell you myself, I was up there for 3 days. Yeah. And walking among everybody, talking to everyone. I mean, it was like the Winterlude Festival of Ottawa that we used to have prior to the COVID. And people just really having a great time of literally hugging each other and like meeting. It was kind of like the whole convoy experience was kind of like a safety valve that let out an awful lot of steam, because a lot of people were saying, here it is. I'm with people who think the same way I do. And it's kind of been like, for many people, is like, is everyone on Prozac or is it just me? It's that kind of a thing. And so the convoy, people to get together to express their frustration over the last 2 years with everything that was going on with the government. And there's been no evidence of any violence, of any inappropriateness that I could see, other than the fact that they occupied the streets, which is not a criminal offense. Yes, that you're entitled to get a parking ticket or a fine or whatever, but very, very different from the way the mainstream media portrayed it. And you were on the inside circle. Can you tell us, what can you tell all of us about just the fact of its non-violent nature?
I've seen all those mainstream media stories and in the government narrative, and I watched old videos from that time last winter and stuff, and I have to say it's incredibly emotional for a lot of us that were in Ottawa to go back and watch the footage of what we were seeing in Ottawa. It's incredibly emotional. It's very, very difficult for many of us. And oftentimes I see these videos where people overlay Justin Trudeau's words and then they show the video and they're absolute opposite of what's really going on, right? Yeah. And obviously these videos are meant to stir a certain type of an emotion of gross hypocrisy at the very least. But we were very, very proud of ourselves for the fact that we did shovel the sidewalks. We provided first aid to people that were injured on the streets. We opened up safety lanes. We did feed homeless because we were getting so much food brought into the city of Ottawa just to feed the truckers. There was an excess. So instead of it going to waste, we knew that the better thing to do would be to give it to the homeless people if we could. We were doing our very best to take the pressure off of the residents of Ottawa in the places that we were located. We weren't trying to be a hindrance. We were trying to be deliberately trying to be Canadians. And there's a story that I had heard years ago when I was very young in the military, and it was from our days when Canadians were in Germany. They were in Lahr and Baden-Baden. The story goes that a German man telling his daughter that if you're ever in trouble and you go past a house and it has a Canadian flag on it, go to that house because those people will help you. And this is kind of the embodiment of the spirit that people had in Ottawa. It was very respectful. Like you said, you were there. It was people that were no longer afraid of their government. They weren't afraid of the police. They weren't afraid of their neighbors. They weren't afraid of physical contact with each other. There was literally no fear there. People trying to get in touch of the humanity that they know had been taken away from us by our government. This was something that we all experienced on a daily basis. Now, one of the hardest things I found is if you were to walk along Wellington and look at all of the posters and the notes and the letters that people had placed along that wall, it was absolutely gut-wrenching to read some of the stuff that was placed on that wall. It's kind of like a vigil that people had placed all their letters. Yeah. And if you read it, it was a monument to the carnage the House of Commons had basically implemented to the lives of Canadians. I had only read a little bit. I couldn't. I mean, I remember very vividly a night being out there and looking at that stuff, and I was too choked up to really continue. But during the day when there was thousands of Canadians that would show up to Ottawa on weekends, you knew you were doing the right thing. You knew you were doing the Canadian thing. There was no way we were going to let that guy take it away from us any further. And then, of course, there was this perverse backdoor deal between the NDP and the Liberal government, this coalition that they had formed but had not yet made public. This is why they were moving all the chess pieces in behind closed doors to make it so that they could invoke the Emergency Act and get the support of the NDP. Canadians were standing up and wanted to be heard by a government that absolutely refused to listen to its tax-paying voters. They absolutely refused to listen. And here we are.
And when that happened, I was up there on, so that'd be February 13, I was there, and my last day there. I was there over two weekends. And then, of course, the next day, February 14, on Valentine's Day, we get the wonderful Valentine's love gift of the Emergencies Act.
Yeah.
I was just amazed. I remember standing in the crowd in front of the flatbed truck, that was the stage and so forth. And I was just, there with my GoPro and just taking pictures of everyone that was there and just thinking, I'm part of history here. I mean, the historical moment of being there in the crowd. And there was no, everyone was being very congenial with everyone. And I just thought, okay, so what is the takeaway? We'll come to the Emergencies Act, but I'd like to know what your thought is with respect to the takeaway of that experience. What has that experience meant prior to the February 14, but that experience, those weeks prior?
My biggest takeaway was how absolutely disconnected from reality the government of Canada was with its own people. Like literally on their doorstep, right there on the doorstep of Parliament, was one of the most joyous Canadian events in I think our history. We refer to every weekend as Canada Day 1, Canada Day 2, Canada Day 3, and then the fourth was when they came in and beat the hell out of Canadians. It was a month-long celebration of what it means or should mean to be Canadians again. It was the public's deep desire to put an end to this government overreach. And to prove to the world that we were a country worth returning to. And yet the government saw it in a completely 180-degree different way than what was really going on out in the street. Now, I believe that that's by intention. I think that they have an agenda that they're trying to push. They did everything in their power to lie, cheat, and steal and say that we were the exact opposite of what was actually out there on their doorstep. And this is the frustrating piece of it, is that so many Canadians that did not participate in Ottawa believe the narrative of the media and of Justin Trudeau. And that's really, really difficult for me to swallow, because at least I've got the comeback. I'm on social media and I'm on pretty much every platform. And when people spread the narrative, the falsehoods or the lies of Trudeau, I say, well, I was there. Were you there? Because I saw it for myself. I mean, I was 3 horses behind when Candace and the other gentleman was run over by the horse.
Yeah.
You know, I was standing right there when it happened. And to say that a bike got thrown at the horse and all these lies, and it's ridiculous. I was standing right there when it happened. It's just the disconnect between the government and the media for what really happened. And the takeaway is that was done deliberately to demonize Canadians.
I have to admit that I have that same opinion. So when the Emergencies Act was invoked, what was the thinking of your group at that point?
There was a phenomenal irony in the moment for me personally, because I was actually having coffee with Brian Peckford.
Oh, okay.
It was literally a personal one-on-one tutorial on what the writers of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms were thinking at the time when they were drafting that. And that was the moment that I had heard that Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergency Act. I'm with the last living author of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as I'm learning that our Charter of Rights and Freedoms have now been thrown in the garbage.
Wow.
It was a really incredible moment. And I mean, I remember looking at Premier Peckford and seeing the look on his face. And he just said, I didn't think the guy would do it. He did it. And we knew, obviously, that they had gone to that length, that the situation had fundamentally changed. We didn't understand the level of violence that the law enforcement was going to bring. We had a good idea, but the sheer level of violence that was put on to Canadian unarmed citizens, and in particular, like, obviously I'm a veteran, so I have a particular bias against for veterans. But when you see what the law enforcement did on the steps of the National War Memorial to combat veterans of this country. Chris Deering is a friend of mine. He's part of Veterans for Freedom. Chris was almost killed. His LAV 3 hit an IED in Afghanistan, and his LAV was propelled 100 feet into the air. Wow. Flipped over. Two of his friends were killed immediately. It flipped over. The turret fell out. Chris fell out of the vehicle, and then the vehicle hit the ground. And luckily, nothing landed on Chris, but he broke several bones in his body, including his hip. Was taken to the ground and beaten by police officers in Ottawa, arrested, and then they put him in a car. They put him in a car and they drove him out into the middle of the country, 20 kilometers away, and kicked him out of the car in the freezing winter.
You got to be joking me.
No. And they did this to several people. This is what
took them outside of Ottawa and dropped them off.
Yes.
In the middle of nowhere.
They did this to several people. And Chris was wearing his medals. And this is what the Ottawa Police, the RCMP, and the OPP did to Canadians on that day. Nobody expected that the law enforcement in this country would have such a disgusting disregard for Canadian citizens.
That's unbelievable. I'm sorry, but that I had no idea.
Yeah. You can see all the video of them, kneeing and butt stroking people. Just brutal beatings of Canadian citizens. This is Justin Trudeau's Tiananmen Square moment, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I want to say something about this too, because this is a really important thing. I just characterized the worst acts that the Canadian police officers in Ottawa could have probably done. But I also want to say there was a lot of Ottawa police officers and OPP and other police of jurisdiction that told their bosses, I'm not going to Ottawa. If you try to send me to Ottawa and to turn on citizens like that, I'm going to go on sick leave, or I'm taking the day off, I'm going on vacation, but do not send me to Ottawa because I won't participate in that. This is an important thing because those police officers don't get to tell their story. They don't get to talk about publicly them pushing back against their chains of command to say, no, I'm going to uphold my oath to the public. Right. And I'm not going to become a Nazi, or I'm not going to become a brown shirt for you just for my paycheck. We saw terrible examples of the worst police officers, the corrupt ones, the ones that just didn't care about what they were going to do to their own citizens. We just never hear about the ones that were fighting for us from the inside.
Right. It's so often we go back and we try to figure out, how is it that a police force could be so brutal on nonviolent protesters. And I mean, we've seen it throughout history, right? I mean,
Yeah.
one of the beauties of the trucker convoy, in my view, is the fact it was nonviolent. It showed the overreach of government. It showed how just by protesting, having your freedom of speech, your freedom of association, and all the rest of it, concerned about your mobility rights, and all of that. I mean, you have a right to protest in this
Yes.
country. And
Yep.
then when you get such a violent approach, it
Yes.
really, really, in my view,
Yeah.
has totally obliterated anything that the government ever says. And then what we have gotten afterwards and what's coming out now with the various court cases that are working their way through with the great work of JCCF and
Yep.
so forth, is
Yep.
that the government, first of all, didn't even have claiming that, okay, the police asked for this. They didn't.
Yep.
And then now we're getting more and more information about how the government didn't even have any kind of scientific basis for the mandates, which was the full reason why the truckers came to Ottawa.
Yeah. It's crumbling around them. Like every argument that they've ever used to justify their coercion has been crumbling. It's all alternative media that is putting it out there. It's people investigating all this. This entire narrative is absolutely crumbling. I'm so excited for the public inquiry about the use of the Emergency Act, because more of it's going to come out. It's going to be live televised. This is all going to come out. It has to come out. You know, the public is entitled to know what their government are doing. And when the mainstream legacy media won't do that, it's up to alternative media to tell that story. And unfortunately, now what you're seeing is on the medical side, you're seeing a number of physicians that are dropping dead. And I think Julie Ponesse the other day tweeted, she said, by her count, we're up to 17 doctors.
17, yeah, I saw that.
I think another one died. I think another one yesterday that I heard about. So I think we're up to 18 doctors. How does this happen? One was a triathlete, one was a former Olympic athlete. How does this happen?
It's quite fascinating. Of course, whenever, an animal, as it were, is cornered, it gets even more vicious. And I think we may see something happen here. Who knows, right? And exactly what government is going to do. But there's an awful lot of interest. Obviously, the government wants to stay in power until their agreement with the NDP to the was it 2025 or something? You were there, the right with Premier Peckford, who's just a jewel of a man, and we're so very happy to have had him during this crisis, to be such a powerful spokesperson as he is. So then it's a matter of what at that point, as far as the truckers are concerned, as far as the leadership. As I read through Andrew Lawton's account, Freedom Convoy, it seemed like, yes, okay, there was a group of people who were trying to organize things, but it's kind of like herding cats, I suppose, in some ways, right? I mean, there's many different outliers and all the rest. But so what happens then after you're talking with Peckford?
We sat down with Premier Peckford, the lawyers and everybody. We recognized, obviously, the situation had fundamentally changed. We had started, it was drafted by Keith Wilson, one of the lawyers that was on the ground with us every single day.
Another great freedom fighter, by the way.
Yes, great guy. Okay. I was with him for the majority of my time in Ottawa. Him and co-counsel is Eva Chipiuk.
Right.
We started strategizing, like the number one thing is, okay, how do we take the pressure off the city? How do we take the pressure off the police? And this was something we were actively doing previous to the Emergency Act. Right. But now we realized, okay, that it's not necessarily working, because every deal that we had made with the city, or the discussions, were now null and void because of the invocation of the Emergency Act. Right. And I want to point out something too, which is important, is that the city itself declared a state of emergency. Then the government of Ontario declared a state of emergency for the province of Ontario. Then they invoked the Emergency Act on top of that for the equivalent of parking violations.
So, right? And of course, we have got to realize that none of this was coordinated.
No, none of it was coordinated at all. None of it was coordinated. So, Keith, we had several discussions, and that same day, Premier Peckford and Tamara did a press conference that we opened up to the mainstream media as well. They also gave statements. That didn't seem to get any traction with the conservative party. So you got to think a lot of the messaging that we wanted, like, I mean, clearly the Liberals aren't listening to anybody. They refused to meet. They didn't care. They were running their game plan. And unfortunately, because of this unholy alliance between the Liberals and the NDP, it really neutralized the official opposition in this country. So the Conservatives were powerless to do anything to stop Justin Trudeau. So Tamara and Peckford had done the live statement, and then we started drafting something called our Roadmap to Freedom. It was a document. It was basically saying, okay, fine, here's the plan for you guys going forward. We'll give you the plan to help this along. Tamara then publicly read this on a live stream, and we had emailed it to members of parliament. I personally emailed it to Pierre Poilievre. And to this day, I still have never received a response even from his staff. I requested a meeting, closed door, no media, no one had to know. I got no response whatsoever from him. Fine, whatever.
It seems that in many ways, the so-called official opposition were not very much being opposed to what was going on here.
And, an important thing to note, too, is that Aaron O'Toole was removed by the Conservatives. I found out something recently. So middle of June, James Topp, myself, and Dr. Paul Alexander got a meeting with federal members of parliament. What's interesting is that in that meeting, only Conservative members of parliament had the moral courage to attend that meeting. And one of the MPs said very clearly, he says, look, you may not think that you guys had support in government, but believe me, I want to assure you that you did. And I'm not quoting directly, but that was the message. So I know that Conservative members were advocating for the convoy, but they were neutralized by the Liberal majority. And Aaron O'Toole. Aaron O'Toole was completely a Liberal in Conservative clothing. And they got rid of him, and then Candice Bergen took over. And the unfortunate thing with Candice is there's something about her I really like. I think she's really good. But I was so disgusted by the fact that she went and did a photo op with the truckers in a little cafe. And then the very next day went into the Commons and said, okay, truckers, you've proved your point. Now go home. It's like, wow, that really helped nobody. You just basically abandoned all hope that the Conservatives were actually going to be an effective opposition of any kind now.
Right.
They were playing politics with us. And, it frustrates me that a lot of them are running around saying that they supported the convoy. Yeah. You know what? Actions speak louder than words. We put out this document, this Roadmap to Freedom. I read it on a separate interview, and then the last day that I was there because I was the one who announced that we would peacefully withdraw from Ottawa, I read aspects of that. And we were calling for a public inquiry into the COVID vaccine mandates. And yet, nothing. There was nothing. No matter what we did or said, the government wouldn't send an envoy. It was like, listen, you either leave or we remove you by force. And that was it. The result was they removed Canadians by extreme force. And it's a miracle to me that nobody was killed.
You know what? I was fully expecting that. I had, unfortunately, I was not able to be there the day that they were working their way up from, the Chateau Laurier and working on. But I had a friend of mine go, and he took video of the horses and all the rest of it. And it was just like unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean,
I was standing there when those horses came through because they had made two sort of passes while I was there. And it would be like trying to stand in front of a snowplow, thinking that you could stop it with your body. Like there was no way. Those horses came through with such power that, I mean, it was a brilliant tactic on the part of the police. There's no way that the crowd is going to be able to withstand that level of power coming through with those horses. But what people don't realize is right behind us were concrete barriers. So we were kind of getting boxed in to the point where it was getting sort of hard for the crowd to maneuver. I mean, you could have stepped over the concrete barriers and stuff. It was fine. It wasn't overly unsafe. But, we were getting less and less room as the horses were starting to come through. Not soon after Candice had been hit by the horse, I had actually left the area and went in a different direction. At some point, I believe that the right thing for me to do was to vacate that area because I noticed that myself, I was starting to succumb to a little bit of mob mentality and perhaps had very aggressive thoughts of my own and realized, okay, the goal is to keep this peaceful.
Right.
And
Right.
so I removed myself from the situation because my animal brain was starting to engage.
Surely.
And I was standing around a bunch of other veterans, and I realized that it was time for me to move out of there because I think my own personal choices would not have been very good. So I left that area.
Well, you know what? That says a lot about you, Tom. And I just want to compliment you on that because I can just imagine, with your own training
Yes.
and all the rest of it, you're so self-aware that you pulled yourself away from a potential incident that would have totally affected the rest of your life and your family's life.
Yes.
So kudos to you. And also to the entire trucker movement, because the fact that none of the leaders were engaged in any kind of violent behavior whatsoever, you showed a stark contrast between what the prime minister in his office implemented and what the truckers actually carried out, which was a non-violent, peaceful protest.
Yes.
And so, I mean, I tip my hat to you, and just hearing your your discussion here now is just like, you know what, way to go. I mean, that's powerful.
Well, and we said from day one that we were a peaceful protest, and we proved it to everybody. We proved it around the world. And
Exactly.
what we said, we proved it and we meant it. I'm actually in awe that there was no violence from our side as well, because it was incredibly difficult to stand there and to be physically assaulted. These people, a lot of these police, I remember this one female police officer from the Sûreté de Québec. That's the Quebec provincial police that were there. It was like, it reminded me of that game Whack-A-Mole that you would see at a carnival. This little police officer who had a full respirator on, she had this spray of pepper spray, and she would just pop out from behind everybody and shoot people in the face with pepper spray, and then duck behind the bigger police officers again. And this went on repetitively. And we had medics there in the crowd, and we would help people wash the pepper spray out of their eyes. This was just disgusting to watch. And I'm amazed myself that people said, "All right, we're going to beat you with nonviolence." That's how we.
What a true testament to really the true Canadian spirit, right? I mean, that's who we are. That's who our flag represents. I was speaking to someone the other day, and they were saying how some people that they know absolutely look at the Canadian flag and they're now embarrassed by it. In other words, they were saying that it represents to them some form of colonialism and all of that. But I look at it and I say, hey, I see people like yourself, Tom, and others who were nonviolent. You were following, the Canadian spirit, as it were.
Yeah, and that's what it is. And I've heard these stories too, where people say, "Oh, the flag now triggers me."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, come on, do better. Do better. Be a better citizen to this country.
Right.
It's that simple. If you're triggered by something you watched on mainstream media, then do better as a citizen. Get more involved in your community. Embrace the idea of what it means to be a Canadian, as opposed to embracing the ideas of what the mainstream media thinks is a good Canadian.
It just strikes me that I look at what the trucker convoy accomplished, and I'm just wondering if you could share what you understand to be the great accomplishments of this convoy.
Well, I know that 27 other countries were inspired by the trucker convoy, and there was 27 other countrywide protests or convoys around this world. I know that a billion people on this planet were watching what the trucker convoy did in Ottawa. And if you look at the Dutch farmers right now, they've openly come out and said, we were inspired by the Canadian trucker convoy in Ottawa and in Coutts and in Windsor and in BC. Canada found its grit again, and it represented and inspired the rest of the world to stand up to their own governments. And I would say Ottawa was successful in the fact that they inspired. We weren't, successful ending the mandates, but we inspired an idea. We inspired people to find their own courage and gave them sort of a blueprint of what they could do that was effective, that they could push back against their own governments. Some countries got what they wanted, what they went and protested with their trucks and all the resources they could bring. A lot of people pushed hard on their government and were successful. We just basically created a blueprint for what could be done across the planet. And for that, I think is a Canada-led thing. Because for 2 years, people felt like they didn't know what they could do. Bridget, Chris, and Tamara, and a lot of the other people in the beginning, Leanne Carter, all these people that were involved in the beginning were the true leaders of this. I played a small part in this after the convoy had arrived.
Right.
But it was ordinary Canadians that made it what it was.
It's interesting you say that you didn't stop the mandates, but I would beg to differ in the sense that you've got Saskatchewan, Premier Moe, right away, he pulled back on the mandates. Jason Kenney, Premier Legault over in Quebec, because he was planning on taxing the unvaccinated. And it seemed that there was tremendous momentum. I think the fact that Erin O'Toole was no longer the leader of the Conservative Party was in part an accomplishment for the trucker convoy, and that you now are getting a Conservative Party that is willing now to stand up to the Liberal Party, which would not have happened, it seems to me. We probably would have gone through another election with an opposition that was really Liberal light, whereas now it's being more distinguished. I'm actually working on a book right now. It's entitled, the working title is 16 Ways the Trucker Convoy Saved Canada, but it might be 20 by the time I'm done. But even then, it could be 50, because I see that this is a defining moment in the history of Canada for the modern times.
Yes.
And to see the average Canadian, I spoke with a number of people when I was up there, and one guy I spoke with, he's lost his house, his wife lost her job too, and they're like, okay, we have nothing else. We're here because we need to be here to let the world know that this is not how you treat people.
Yes.
And so it's that kind of spirit that has really, it seems to me, caused an awakening within the Canadian public. Now, granted, it's not everyone. Granted, there's huge numbers of people that will follow whatever the Prime Minister says as the gospel truth without any kind of analysis, because he said it, right? And it's kind of like what Catherine McKenna said, as long as we say it over and over and over, they'll believe it, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I think a lot of those people, unfortunately, work at Georgian College in Barrie. I hate to say it. Yeah, I want to point out one thing too. Rebel Media, they just put out an hour and 15-minute documentary about the Coutts blockade. And I think it's called The Truckers' Rebellion. And I've watched it twice, and it is excellent. And I have to say, we were very, very deliberately not communicating with any of the other protests. We did that deliberately because we knew that they would paint us as a national coordinating center. And that was just not true. And all of these protests around the country were all grassroots. Nobody was coordinating anything. But what was interesting to me was how effective Coutts actually ended up resulting. I didn't know. And I was out in Alberta, and I got to meet some of the participants of the Coutts blockade. I watched this documentary, and I learned a lot about what they did. And I was so amazed. I was so impressed with the Coutts in Milk River and what happened out there. These people were incredibly impressive. I watched that documentary twice. I wish that we could have publicly given more public support for what was going on in Alberta, but we were kind of, we had our hands full, obviously, in Ottawa, but wow, they did an amazing job there. And they're the ones who really pushed Jason Kenney to listen and to take the appropriate action. Really, really impressive what they did in Coutts.
And that's so great. Thank you for that. And also, wasn't it Coutts where apparently they found some armaments or some and then immediately the truckers were like, no, this is not what we're about. And so then they all peacefully left. I mean, it was singing "O Canada," as I remember.
Yeah. The actual truth to that story is that it was a local resident who had those weapons in his home. And he had actually approached the truckers and said, hey, if this gets ugly, I've got stuff here. Wow. And the truckers got really freaked out, and they actually reported it to the RCMP themselves. And then what happened? The RCMP went, arrested that person, used a photograph that apparently was actually taken from a previous incident at a different time in a different location, and smeared the truckers with it and said that the truckers had guns.
Oh, have mercy.
Outright lie. And there's another thing. I had heard the stories about how badly the RCMP went and vandalized farm equipment. They were cutting lines, removing solenoids, using spray foam insulation inside hydraulic lines, just doing thousands of dollars of damage to farm equipment. Like, it's disgusting. And, I learned a lot about the RCMP when I was out in Alberta last week. And I know there's a very strong movement of Albertans. If Danielle Smith gets in as the next premier, they're going to expel the RCMP from that province and implement their own provincial police. And I absolutely agree with it. I don't think there should be federal police dominating a province. I think provincial police are appropriate and local police are appropriate. They need to really expel the RCMP from that province as a major police of jurisdiction there. Their behavior since the flooding in 2013 or 14, where they went in and basically removed people from their homes because of a flood, an emergency, and then they went in and confiscated their weapons, their legally obtained firearms. The RCMP confiscated it from empty homes. I spoke to several people from Alberta that told me firsthand that the RCMP went in after the fact and tossed their homes and confiscated their legal firearms. So there's a lot of, Alberta is the place to watch. I think Alberta could really be a strong leader for the rest of the provinces. I think Ontario is too far gone. I mean, under Doug Ford, he campaigns as a conservative, but he governs as a liberal. And unfortunately, Ontarians fall for it every time. I think in terms of provincial leadership, I think Alberta is going to be the province to watch, and probably Saskatchewan as well.
Tom, I want to talk about the whole situation, the bail experience with Tamara Leach. As a lawyer, I haven't done much in the way of criminal law at all.
Right.
Talking to a lot of my colleagues about the situation and just observing what is expected on a bail and all the rest of it. I have some friends, family who are in the police force, and they're like, this is unheard of.
Yes.
What's your, and of course, you ended up being caught up into this. What's your take on what happened to Tamara?
It is so unprecedented what actually happened. Most of the law enforcement people that I know too are just absolutely stunned by what had happened as well. Danny Bulford and I on the Veterans for Freedom podcast, we talked about it as well. Other police that I know, some of the lawyers were just blown away by absolute disregard for normal practices in law enforcement for handling bail or breach of conditions. The story is kind of long and drawn out. And there's a lot of irony associated with it too, because Tamara had these bail conditions for which her lawyers were contesting. They actually were appealing the bail conditions. One of the bail conditions was that she's not allowed to enter into Ontario. They were appealing these conditions. Mm-hmm. They couldn't get into a court. But then the JCCF named Tamara as the recipient of the George Jonas Freedom Award.
Right.
And just by virtue of Tamara accepting a Freedom Award, the Crown Prosecutor in Ottawa deemed her to be in violation of her bail condition. He got into a courtroom and he was seeking to have Tamara thrown back in jail just because she accepted an award of freedom. So that's the first irony. They get into a courtroom and the judge said, no, that's ridiculous. And by the way, Tamara can now, the only bail condition he changed was she could come to Ontario.
Right.
She's still not allowed to enter into the city of Ottawa. She was allowed. The judge knew she'd be going to the George Jonas Freedom Award, so she did. I was invited to this. Now, her bail conditions state that she cannot have direct communication with me unless in the presence of her lawyers. The lawyers are the ones who sponsored the dinner. Almost all of the lawyers from Ontario and some from Alberta were at the dinner, including her criminal lawyer. We were surrounded by Tamara's lawyers. And I was put at the dinner table with her. I hardly had any communication with her because there was too many people, too many guests of the dinner that wanted to talk to Tamara, wanted to shake her hand, take pictures with her. So she was busy that night. We confirmed with the lawyers, is it okay, for me to be there because that's part of her condition? And they said, no, it's fine. She's in the presence of counsel. You're not here to talk about anything else. And there was even, Tamara's husband was seated between us. And on the left side of Tamara was the head of the JCCF, John Carpe. So she gave her speech. It was a brilliant speech. She delivered it very well. And when she stepped off the stage, I just congratulated her on such a great speech. That's it. 3 seconds. She sat down. And the Crown tried to make the case that within those 3 seconds, Tamara and I plotted a successful strategy to overthrow the entire planet. Right? Like, and then there was a social media picture that was posted, and the Crown used that to issue a countrywide, a national warrant, and sent 2 homicide detectives to go apprehend her in her home. They brought her back to Ottawa. She spent a total of 25 days in incarceration. Now, the first person she went before was a justice of the peace. Like, I'm qualified to be a justice of the peace. You don't have to go to law school.
That's right.
So you get this fool who doesn't understand the law at all and decided that she was a menace to society. But yet, when we look at what happened in Alberta during the convoy, there was an incident where, a man drove his car into 4 protesters and was very next day out on bail. I mean, this is attempted murder, and he was out on bail the next day. Tamara posed for a photograph, gave a speech, walked by somebody who said something kind to her, warranted a national warrant for her arrest. Okay, like, this is the lunacy of this Liberal government's interference in law.
And again, it's the overreach, right? It's like jumping the shark. It's way overdone.
Yes, absolutely overdone. So she finally got be in front of a real judge, a lawyer, who basically said, this is ridiculous. Let her go. Let her go. And so she was out on bail, obviously, still same conditions. But unfortunately now they increased the amount of her surety, right? So that's put more burden onto Tamara and her surety now as a result of this. And let's look at the plane tickets. Let's look at the cost. All the money that the taxpayers had to absorb because this Crown, or should I say clown prosecutor, is a Liberal card-carrying member and a donor to the Federal Liberal Party of Canada. You can't tell me that this is not politically motivated. It absolutely is politically motivated. Even the Attorney General of Ontario has escaped all public ire for allowing this prosecutor to go forward and do this. I mean, come on. There was no reasonable grounds that they were going to get a conviction based off of a photograph. How did this serve the public's interest to even take these actions against Tamara in the first place?
It seems to me it's almost now becoming a bit of a show trial on this bail hearing. Kind of like the government is saying, listen, we are letting everyone know in Canada that this is what happens if you go against our narrative, if you go against our preferred view of the world, as it were.
It's absolute intimidation of the public. It is making an example. And the beautiful thing to me, to be perfectly honest, the thing I find hilarious is that they thought that by going after Tamara, that maybe they were going to, somehow break her spirit or use her as an example of, like, we could crush you. It's like, could you have picked the worst person? Because Tamara is hard as nails, and she wasn't going to ever be defeated by the likes of this prosecutor or Justin Trudeau or anyone else. There's no way they were going to break Tamara. That's not possible. She's unbreakable.
But, it's quite fascinating when I was looking at her video the night before she was arrested, and how she called upon everyone to be nonviolent, treat everyone with love, and to pray for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has 3 beautiful children, she said.
Yes.
He's a family man. We need to pray for him.
Yes.
And I thought, wow, isn't that amazing? While the Prime Minister calls the trucker convoy, and obviously Tamara, he's disgusted and all of this, Tamara is asking the country to pray for the Prime Minister.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
And what saddens me is the number of people in this country that side with Justin Trudeau and say a lot of disgusting filth about the convoy and what they were about. Because I think, by and large, the only reason Justin Trudeau can get away with what he's done and what he continues to do is because he funds the mainstream media, and they just lap it up and regurgitate what he says. He controls the narrative through the media. I'm basically saying that mass psychosis, mass formation psychosis can only be made possible through the media, and it works.
And it works well. I mean, George Orwell recognized this himself when he wrote 1984.
Yes.
But also he recognized the role that the media played on convincing the public. He worked for a while with BBC during the war.
Yes.
And he understood what was happening. I mean, even the BBC, because they were trying to get the entire population around supporting the war against Germany and all the rest. And he saw how the media was used as propaganda. And then, of course, he wrote that amazing novel. And this is indeed what we're seeing now. Right before us, we got to open our eyes, recognize that we've got professional people there in the media and in the Prime Minister's office. I mean, I go back to when Jody Wilson-Raybould was dismissed by the Prime Minister. Then it came out how his chief of staff, Ms. Telford, was saying, well, you know, during the negotiations, we can work on getting people writing op-eds so we can support her in the media. You know, in other words, we can massage the public. That was my very first clue of, okay, you know what? There's a big education propaganda project going on here that we have not seen to the extent that we have ever experienced in this country. And we see it with the trucker convoy in spades.
Yeah, you got to laugh at the hypocrisy of Trudeau because he comes out as a feminist, except for when the strong women disagree with him. And then he destroys their careers.
Yeah.
It just amazes me. How many more scandals can this guy get away with?
It is truly amazing to see. I want to close with a short discussion on the public inquiry that's coming up, because now Canada is we're going to be regurgitating all that went on with respect to the convoy. Any hopes, but also any concerns that you have with the inquiry?
So I do have a few concerns, but I cannot discuss them openly for obvious reasons. But my hopes are enormous. I'm excited for this. You can already see, like, all the justification for the last 6 months have really been coming out in alternative media. I mean, even when the Emergency Act was invoked, we immediately knew that it was improperly being applied. There was 3 conditions to it, and none of them were being met.
That's right.
So that was pretty encouraging from day one. From the 14th of February, we knew that this was completely false and a misuse of a never-before act. This is all going to come out, and I'm very excited about it because the intent of the public inquiry is to answer one question. And that question is, was the Emergency Act properly invoked? Yes or no? And I don't mean proper in terms of, you know, the mechanism, but was it justifiably invoked is what, you know, a better way of phrasing it. It is a yes or no question. So if it's deemed that it was justifiable, which I can't comprehend how that would even be the case, knowing what we've always known, I think there's going to be a lot of shock in this country. I think it will do more harm to the reputation of this country. I think international partners are going to look at this and say, okay, we've got a banana republic in Canada right now, and it's time to start doing something, because this is a clearly fraudulent, corrupt result to this public inquiry. So that's one aspect. If and when, what I do believe, they will determine that, no, it was not justifiable. I think that my personal belief, and nobody else's, this is me saying, I believe it will result in a vote of non-confidence of Justin Trudeau. How can you be determined that your use of the Emergency Act against your own people and the violence that you used against your own people was deemed unjustifiable, and you're still fit to stay in office? How can it be? So I think it has to go to a vote of non-confidence. What does concern me about that is a vote of non-confidence could then be shot down by the likes of Jagmeet Singh, the NDP, and perhaps even the Bloc Québécois. So we could have democracy stolen from us because of of people like Jagmeet Singh and maybe the Bloc. And the Bloc are not signatories to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? There's no federal MPs from the Bloc Québécois outside of the province of Quebec, which is a province that never signed on to the charter anyway. My concern is that they're not going to care if we ever get to a non-confidence vote. They might just prop up the government anyway.
One of the things I found quite amazing at the trucker convoy was how many people from Quebec were there.
Yeah.
So
yes.
obviously the people of Quebec certainly support the convoy, at least from what I observed when I was up there.
There was a phenomenally strong contingent of Quebec truckers. These guys were there to win. These guys were really rock solid.
Yeah.
I was really impressed by the Quebec truckers. Yeah. But, we had ones from New Brunswick. We had truckers from all over the country. But even the territories had representation. So it was an all Canadian convoy and all ethnicities as well.
Listen, Tom, I just want to thank you so much for your time. But is there any final word that you would like to leave to our viewers?
I'm very hopeful, actually, for the future. I think all of us at one point went through a dark period of deep concern about the direction of this country. But I've recently, coming back from Alberta, I've turned a mental positive corner. And I'm actually very, very hopeful for the future of Canada. I don't feel as dark and dire as I did maybe months ago. I think we're going to see a brighter future. Now, I'm concerned deeply about people that are on their third and fourth booster. But in terms of those who did not partake, I'm very, very hopeful for the future of this country. But I do think there's a couple of dark elements that we're going to have to confront. And that's only time is going to tell on that one. So the public inquiry, I think, is going to be the catalyst of a much brighter future for Canada.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank you for watching our program today. And you may not agree with the opinions and views of our guests as well as of myself. But the thing is, here on Freedom Feature, we were wanting to have open, honest, and transparent dialogue. And thank you for being with us. And until next time, I'm Barry Bussey. The fight for freedom consists not only in the legal battles in court, but also in the battle of ideas at the universities and in the media. It takes time, effort, and money to keep on top of the debates for freedom. Your donation allows us to keep fighting for all Canadians. Firstfreedoms.ca